Most evacuations happen for emergencies, fires, storms, wildlife threats. Sector 12 evacuations happen at dawn. Every dawn. It's not an emergency protocol, it's standard procedure. All rangers in Sector 12 must be out by sunrise, no exceptions, no delays. The order has been in effect since 1987, no official explanation. But rangers who've worked the overnight shift describe what happens at dawn in Sector 12. The shadows don't shorten as the sun rises. They lengthen, moving opposite the sun, growing darker instead of fading. And rangers who've stayed past sunrise report their own shadows separating from them, continuing to move while they stand still. Sector 12 is a northern wilderness region covering approximately 47 square miles. Dense forest, minimal trails, no public access. The sector exists for resource management and fire monitoring, not recreation. Standard Forest Service protocol assigns rangers to patrol sectors in 24-hour rotating shifts. Dawn transition is routine. Overnight rangers leave, day shift arrives, coverage continues without interruption. Every sector follows this pattern. Except Sector 12. In Sector 12, all personnel must evacuate by sunrise. Complete withdrawal. The sector sits empty from dawn until full daylight, approximately 43 minutes depending on the season. No ranger is permitted to witness sunrise from within Sector 12's boundaries. The evacuation order doesn't appear in public-facing manuals. It's not listed as emergency protocol. You won't find it in the standard duty roster. It exists as a verbal directive, passed from supervisor to ranger during overnight assignment briefings. The instruction is always the same. You have until sunrise, not dawn, not first light, sunrise. When the sun breaks the horizon, you need to be outside, Sector 12's northern boundary. That's not a recommendation. That's the order. Rangers don't question it, not after they've worked one overnight shift in Sector 12. Because by the time you've spent a night there, you understand why the evacuation order exists. And you don't want to be there when the sun comes up. The first documented incident occurred in November 1987. Ranger Marcus Webb was assigned to overnight patrol in Sector 12, standard fire watch. Temperature was dropping, conditions dry, and the Forest Service wanted eyes on the area during high-risk hours. Webb entered Sector 12 at 2200 hours. His assignment was straightforward. Patrol the fire roads, check for illegal camping, monitor conditions, and exit by dawn when the day shift arrived. He'd worked overnight patrols before. Sector 12 was no different from any other remote area. Quiet, dark, isolated. He had his radio, his vehicle, his flashlight. Nothing unusual. Webb's last radio check was at 5:47 a.m. He reported normal conditions, no fires. No activity, weather clear. Sunrise was calculated for 6:14 a.m. that morning. At 6:22 a.m., the day shift ranger entered Sector 12 from the northern access road. He found Webb's vehicle parked at the Sector 12 fire tower, engine running, driver's door open, radio still transmitting static. Webb was standing approximately 30 feet from his vehicle, facing east, toward the rising sun, not moving. The day shift ranger called out to him. Webb didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the call in any way. The ranger approached. He could see Webb's face clearly now. Eyes open, expression blank, breathing steady. Webb wasn't unconscious. He was standing, alert. But he wasn't responding. And then the day shift ranger noticed Webb's shadow. It was wrong. The sun had risen in the east. Light was coming from behind Webb. His shadow should have been cast west, stretching out in front of him away from the sun. But Webb's shadow was east of him, between him and the sunrise. The shadow was positioned as if the light source were behind Webb instead of in front of him, as if the sun were in the wrong direction. The day shift ranger stopped walking. His chest tightened. His hands went cold. He looked at his own shadow. It was correct, cast west by the eastern sunrise, exactly as it should be. But Webb's shadow was reversed. The ranger keyed his radio. "Base, this is Range 4. I need immediate supervisor response at Sector 12 Fire Tower. I have a situation with Range 7. He's not responding and something is wrong with his positioning." Dispatch sent a supervisor immediately. By the time the supervisor arrived, 8:15 a.m., full daylight, sun well above the horizon, Webb's shadow had corrected itself. It was in the proper position, west of Webb, cast by eastern light, and Webb was responsive again. He turned when the supervisor called his name. He blinked. He looked confused. "What happened?" the supervisor asked. Webb's face was pale. His hands shook. "I don't know," he said. "I was waiting for sunrise. I was going to leave right after. But when the sun came up, I couldn't move. I tried. I could see the light. I could feel it on my face. But I couldn't turn around. I couldn't walk back to my truck." "How long were you standing there?" "I don't know. Minutes? It felt like minutes." The day shift ranger spoke up. "It was over an hour. From when I found you to now." Webb stared at him. "That's not possible." But it was. Webb filed an incident report describing disorientation during dawn transition and, quote, possible medical episode requiring evaluation. He requested transfer out of overnight Sector 12 assignments. The request was approved. And 3 weeks later, the Forest Service issued the evacuation protocol. All personnel must exit Sector 12 by sunrise. No explanation was provided in the directive, no reference to Webb's incident, just the instruction: be out by sunrise. The order has remained in effect ever since. The second account comes from Ranger Lisa Holt, who worked Sector 12 overnight shifts in 1993. Holt was experienced. She'd been with the Forest Service for 9 years and had worked solo overnight patrols in remote sectors across 3 different forests. She wasn't easily unsettled. When she was briefed on the Sector 12 evacuation protocol, she asked the obvious question, why? Her supervisor's answer was blunt. Because rangers who stay past sunrise report shadow anomalies. You'll see what I mean if you push the timing. Don't push the timing. Holt didn't push it. For her first 3 shifts in Sector 12, she was out by 5:45 a.m., well before sunrise. No incidents, no anomalies. But on her 4th shift, conditions changed. At 4:30 a.m., Holt received a report of possible illegal camping near the eastern ridge of Sector 12. Campfire smoke had been spotted by a civilian hiker outside the sector boundary. Holt drove to the location. The access road was rough, and it took longer than expected to reach the ridge. By the time she arrived, it was 5:50 a.m. Sunrise was at 6:18 a.m. She had 28 minutes. Holt found the campsite quickly. Abandoned. The fire was out, but still warm. Whoever had been there had left recently, probably spooked by the sound of her vehicle. She documented the site, extinguished the remaining embers, and returned to her truck at 6:05 a.m. 13 minutes until sunrise. Plenty of time. The northern boundary was a 10-minute drive on clear road. But Holt's vehicle wouldn't start. She turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, then nothing. Dead. Holt felt her pulse spike. She checked her watch. 6:07 a.m., 11 minutes. She radioed dispatch. Range 8 to base. I have a vehicle malfunction in Sector 12, Eastern Ridge Access Road. I need immediate pickup. Sunrise in 11 minutes. Dispatch responded immediately. Range 8, evacuate on foot. Do not wait for vehicle recovery. Exit Sector 12 now. Holt grabbed her radio and flashlight and started running. The northern boundary was 3 miles on foot. Holt ran. She didn't look back. She didn't check her watch. She focused on the trail ahead, her boots pounding dirt, her breath burning in her chest. She could see the sky lightening ahead of her, dawn glow spreading across the horizon. She checked her watch. 16 a.m. 2 minutes. She wasn't going to make it. At 6:18 a.m., the sun broke the horizon. Holt was still inside Sector 12. She stopped running, not because she wanted to, because her body stopped responding. Her legs locked, her arms froze mid-swing. She stood on the trail, breathing hard, unable to move. And she felt the sunlight hit her back. Warm, bright, coming from the east as it should. But her shadow was wrong. Holt looked down. Her shadow stretched ahead of her on the trail, long and dark. But the sun was behind her. The shadow should have been behind her too. Her shadow was reversed. And then it moved. Not with her. She was standing still, frozen in place, unable to take another step. But her shadow shifted, tilted. The head turned slightly, as if looking back at her. Holt's throat closed. Her vision tunneled. She tried to scream, but couldn't make sound. The shadow took a step forward. Away from her, down the trail, moving independently. Holt watched her own shadow walk ahead of her, its shape perfect, its movements smooth, as if it were a separate entity that had detached and was now walking the path she'd been running. She stood paralyzed, watching her shadow continue north toward the boundary. Seconds passed, maybe a minute. Holt couldn't track time. She could only watch as her shadow moved farther away, growing fainter as the distance increased. And then, abruptly, her body released. She gasped, stumbled forward, her legs worked again, her arms swung freely. She looked down. Her shadow was back, positioned correctly behind her, cast by the sun as it should be. She didn't wait, she ran. She covered the remaining mile to the northern boundary in 8 minutes and didn't stop until she was outside Sector 12's limits. A recovery team retrieved her vehicle later that day. The engine started immediately, no mechanical issues found. Holt filed a report describing dawn disorientation and possible neurological episode. She requested permanent reassignment out of Sector 12. The request was approved within hours. Holt left the Forest Service entirely 6 months later. She never worked another overnight shift. The phenomenon is consistent across accounts. Rangers who remain in Sector 12 past sunrise report the same sequence. First, paralysis. The body stops responding. Movement becomes impossible. You can see, hear, breathe, think, but you cannot move. Second, shadow reversal. Your shadow appears in the wrong position relative to the sun, east instead of west, light instead of dark, reverse geometry that shouldn't exist. Third, separation. The shadow detaches. It moves independently, continues walking, standing, gesturing, whatever motion you were making when the sun rose, while you remain frozen. The separated shadow doesn't attack, doesn't threaten, it simply continues, as if it's the real version of you and you're the shadow that got left behind. In 2001, the Forest Service attempted to document the phenomenon scientifically. A team of 3 researchers entered Sector 12 with authorization to remain past sunrise under controlled conditions. They brought cameras, light meters, GPS units, and direct radio contact with a supervisor stationed outside the boundary. The goal was to observe, measure, and document whatever happened at dawn. The team positioned themselves at 3 separate locations within Sector 12, Northern Ridge, Central Valley, Eastern Fire Road. Each researcher had clear sightlines, functional equipment, and confirmed communication. Sunrise was at 6:23 a.m. At 6:24 a.m., all 3 researchers stopped responding to radio calls. The supervisor outside the boundary attempted contact every 30 seconds. No response. Radio signals were transmitting. The channels were open. The equipment functional. but no one answered. At 6:52 a.m., 29 minutes after sunrise, the researchers resumed communication. All three reported the same experience. They'd been standing in position, watching the sunrise, when their bodies stopped responding. Paralysis set in instantly. They could see, could hear the radio calls, could think clearly, but they couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't key the radio to respond. And then they saw their shadows. All three researchers described the same shadow reversal. Shadows positioned opposite the sun. Shadows that didn't match the light source. Two of the researchers reported their shadows separating and moving independently. One shadow walked north. The other turned in a slow circle as if surveying the area. The third researcher reported something different. His shadow didn't move. It grew. He described watching his shadow stretch and darken, expanding across the ground in all directions simultaneously, as if the light source were shrinking or the shadow itself were gaining mass. The shadow grew until it covered an area approximately 40 feet in diameter, a massive dark circle with the researcher at its center. And then, at 6:52 a.m., the shadows returned to normal. All three researchers regained movement simultaneously. Their shadows corrected to proper positions. The paralysis released. They evacuated Sector 12 immediately. The recorded footage from their cameras showed nothing unusual. Sunrise appeared normal. Shadows were correctly positioned in every frame. No reversal, no separation, no expansion. Whatever happened, the cameras didn't capture it. Or the phenomenon doesn't exist in a form that cameras can record. The research team filed their reports. All three described the experience consistently: paralysis, shadow reversal, independent movement. But without visual evidence, the findings were classified as, quote, subjective accounts and potential perceptual distortion due to environmental factors. The evacuation protocol remained in effect. No further research was authorized. The current theory, never officially stated but widely understood among Sector 12 personnel, is that dawn in Sector 12 creates a transitional state. Not between night and day, between presence and absence. When the sun rises, light and shadow shift positions. The world transitions from darkness to illumination. Shapes that were hidden become visible. Shadows that were absent suddenly appear. In most places, this transition is instant. Shadows form as light hits objects. Cause and effect happen simultaneously. But in Sector 12, there's a delay. A gap between the light arriving and the shadow forming. And in that gap, those few seconds or minutes when light is present but shadows haven't yet aligned, your shadow exists independently. Not as a projection of your body blocking light, but as a separate thing. A presence that was always there, waiting in the space where your shadow would be, and now has a few moments to move on its own before the geometry corrects and it's locked back into position. This is speculation, unproven, unscientific. But it's the explanation Rangers use when they brief new personnel on Sector 12 overnight shifts. Your shadow is always there, they say, even when you can't see it, even in total darkness. It's there, occupying the space where the shadow would be if there were light. And at dawn, when the light comes but the geometry hasn't settled yet, your shadow gets a few moments to move independently. To be itself instead of being you. And if you're still in Sector 12 when that happens, you'll see it. And once you see it, you'll understand why we evacuate. In 2014, a ranger named Carlos Mendez violated the evacuation protocol deliberately. Mendez had worked Sector 12 for 3 years. He'd never missed an evacuation. He'd never pushed the timing. He'd always been out by sunrise, exactly as ordered. But Mendez was skeptical. He didn't believe the shadow accounts. He thought they were psychological: stress, isolation, sleep deprivation, creating hallucinations that rangers interpreted as supernatural. He wanted proof. He wanted to stay past sunrise and document what actually happened. So on his final shift before transferring to a different district, Mendez remained in Sector 12 past dawn. He positioned himself in the Central Valley with a clear view east. He had his phone, recording video. He had his radio, open channel to dispatch. He was prepared to document everything. Sunrise was at 6:31 a.m. Mendez stood in position, camera recording, watching the horizon. At 6:31 a.m., the sun broke the horizon. Mendez's video recording continued for another 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The footage shows Mendez standing motionless, facing east as the sun rises. His shadow is visible on the ground behind him, correctly positioned, cast west by eastern light. Nothing appears unusual in the video, no reversal, no separation, no anomalies. But at 6 hours, 35 minutes and 17 seconds, Mendez's body jerks violently. He drops his phone. The camera hits the ground, lens facing sky, still recording. Audio continues for another 6 minutes. Heavy breathing, footsteps. A voice, Mendez's voice, saying, "No, no, 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 no," repeatedly, the words running together, panic escalating. Then silence. At 6 hours, 41 minutes and 33 seconds, the recording ends. A recovery team found Mendez at 7:15 a.m., sitting on the ground near where his phone had fallen. He was unresponsive, eyes open, breathing normally. But he didn't acknowledge the recovery team, didn't react to their presence. They transported him to medical evaluation immediately. Mendez remained unresponsive for 3 hours. Then, abruptly, he blinked, focused, and asked where he was. Medical staff asked what he remembered. Mendez described watching the sunrise, watching his shadow on the ground. Everything appeared normal. And then his shadow stood up. Not detached, not separated. It stood up while he remained standing, as if the shadow had depth, had 3 dimensions, and was now rising from the ground while he stayed in place. It stood up and turned around, Mendez said, his voice shaking. It looked at me. My shadow looked at me. I was standing there, and it was standing there, and we were looking at each other, and I realized it wasn't my shadow. I was its shadow. I was the projection. It was the real thing. And when the geometry corrected and the light locked me back into position, I felt myself flatten. I felt my body lose dimension and collapse into the shape on the ground. I became the shadow, and it became me. Medical staff documented this as, quote, acute dissociative episode and possible psychotic break. Mendez was placed on medical leave. He did not return to the Forest Service. His video footage was reviewed extensively. It shows nothing unusual. Mendez is visible throughout. His shadow is correctly positioned. No standing shadow. No reversal. But Mendez insists the video is wrong. The camera can't see it, he said in his final statement, because the camera doesn't have a shadow. Only living things do. Only things with presence cast shadows. And at dawn in Sector 12, the shadows remember that they're the originals. We're the copies. And for a few minutes they get to be themselves. The evacuation protocol remains in effect. All Rangers assigned to Sector 12 overnight shifts are briefed verbally. Exit by sunrise. No exceptions. Most Rangers comply. They've heard the accounts. They've read the incident reports. They understand the order isn't precautionary. It's experiential, based on repeated, consistent testimony from trained personnel who have no reason to fabricate. But occasionally, a ranger pushes the timing. Not deliberately, not out of curiosity, just circumstances. An animal sighting that requires tracking. A suspected fire that needs confirmation. A vehicle malfunction that delays departure. And when that happens, when a ranger remains in Sector 12 past sunrise, the reports are always the same. Paralysis, shadow, reversal, separation. The shadow moves independently while the ranger stands frozen, and the shadow is always described the same way. It looked more real than I did. If you're a ranger, check your sector assignment before accepting overnight shifts. If Sector 12 appears on your roster, pay attention to the evacuation briefing. Note the sunrise time for that date. Memorize it. Set an alarm for 30 minutes before. Give yourself buffer time. Because the evacuation order isn't about fire risk or weather or wildlife. It's about shadows. And what happens when the light arrives but the geometry hasn't corrected yet? At dawn, shadows are supposed to form as light hits objects. Instant, simultaneous, locked into position by the angle of the sun. But in Sector 12, there's a delay. A gap between the light arriving and the shadow aligning. And in that gap, your shadow exists independently. Not as an absence of light, as a presence. Something that occupies the space where your shadow would be. Something that's always been there. Something that gets a few moments at dawn to move on its own before the sun locks it back into position beneath you. If you're in Sector 12 when the sun rises, you'll see it. You'll see your shadow move while you stand still. You'll watch it walk away, or turn to look at you, or grow until it covers the ground around you. And you'll understand why the evacuation order exists. Because once your shadow separates, you can't be sure which one is real. The body standing in the light, or the shadow walking away. Rangers who've experienced shadow separation describe the same lasting effect. Uncertainty. Not about the experience itself. They know what they saw. They know their shadow moved independently. But about which version of themselves returned to normal when the geometry corrected. I walked out of Sector 12, one ranger said. I drove home. I went back to work. I continued my life. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm the shadow. That the real me is still standing in Sector 12, frozen in place, watching the sunrise, and I'm just the projection that walked away. Another ranger described looking in mirrors differently now. I checked to see if my reflection moves independently. I know that's irrational, but after watching my shadow detach and move on its own, I can't trust that I'm the original. Maybe I'm the copy. Maybe the real me is somewhere else, and I'm just the shadow that learned to walk. This is the psychological cost of staying past sunrise in Sector 12. Not fear, not trauma. Doubt. Doubt about your own reality. About which version of you is primary and which is projection. Because if your shadow can separate and move independently, what does that make you? The source of the shadow? Or the shadow of something else? The evacuation order is simple. Be out by sunrise. It's been in effect since 1987. It will remain in effect as long as Sector 12 requires overnight patrols. Because the Forest Service learned something that year that they've never officially documented. Shadows are not passive. They're not simply the absence of light. They're something that exists in the space your body blocks, something that's always there whether you can see it or not, something that's normally locked into position by the geometry of light and form. But at dawn, when the light arrives before the geometry settles, shadows get a moment of independence. A few seconds. Maybe a few minutes. Just long enough to move. Just long enough to remind you that you might not be the original. If you work overnight in Sector 12, follow the evacuation order. Set your alarm, check the sunrise time, give yourself margin. And when you leave, don't look back. Don't check to see if your shadow is following you. Because if you look, you might see it still standing there. Still watching the sunrise. Still frozen in place in Sector 12 while you walk away. And if you see that, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering which one is real. The you that left? Or the you that stayed? The evacuation order doesn't answer that question. It just makes sure you don't have to ask it. Be out by sunrise. No exceptions. Because your shadow is always there. And at dawn in Sector 12, it remembers that it came first.